Well, thank you very much for these kind words about myself, and you were spot on, despite being from, say, looking at me from outside of political science. It's absolutely delightful to be here at University of Pennsylvania. Last time I was in Philadelphia was actually for the American Political Science Association meeting 2006, so it's some time ago. Now, what I want to talk about, you can already see on the slide. Incidentally, these patches, colored patches, are not just some kind of decorative background, but they actually stem from geographic information systems. You're looking at parts of Africa, the Horn of Africa, roughly. So it's coming straight out of our database. And indeed, today I'm going to be talking about this nexus between inequality and violence. Inequality violates people's notion of justice, generating resentment among the disadvantaged that can easily spill over into violence. I think a good place to start here, if I can get the next slide, yes, is indeed the storming of the Bastille. In 1789, the French Revolution was the birth moment of modern representative democracy. After years of having been frozen out of politics, the bourgeoisie rose up and swept away decades of privilege accumulated and hoarded by the Ancien Régime. Having been asked to contribute to an increasing tax burden to finance expansive foreign adventures, the members of the tiers-état had had enough. So few historians would doubt that conflict along class lines fueled resentment that ignited spectacularly, triggering history's perhaps most consequential revolution. If we are looking for a smoking gun, validating the link between inequality and violence, this would be it. Yet, what is sometimes overlooked is that besides democratizing the world in an irreversible way, the French Revolution also transformed the link between the rulers and the ruled in another fundamental way. Rather than the monarch, now it was the nation viewed as a collective of citizens who constituted the locus of sovereignty and were the source of legitimate exercise of power. Thus, the French Revolution was as much, or possibly even more, about nationalism than about democracy. You only have to walk a few blocks from here to be reminded that of this fundamental fact. Indeed, Philadelphia is as important as a revolutionary site as is Paris. After all, this is where we find Independence Hall, which celebrates the principle of national self-determination. No taxation without representation was the slogan of the 13 American colonies that broke away from their mother country in 1776, thus preceding the French Revolution by more than a decade. The American Revolution symbolizes the link between inequality and violence, because the British did not go voluntarily, and there was indeed a war of independence before the colonies could secede. After the great revolutions at the end of the 18th century, the shift from territorial to popular sovereignty took some time to revolutionize international politics. But thanks to Napoleon's conquests, the principle of nationalism spread like brush fire through Europe, awakening German nationalism before impacting Eastern Europe and the rest of the world. The forces of restoration were no match for this world historical tsunami. Austria's Prince Metternich tried vainly to put the nationalist genie back into the bottle and called Italy nothing more than a geographic expression. But it was he who had to resign in 1848, and a few years later, Italy was unified. 2 world wars later, nationalism is still with us, for better or for worse, while class politics remains a potent force of grievances and violence in the world. I would submit that the root of most contemporary conflicts around the world can be found in nationality problems that highlight ethno-nationalist cleavages. For this reason, I will focus on inequalities between ethnic groups and how these often produce violence tonight. In fact, at least when it comes to large-scale violence in today's world, this is the most consequential type of inequality, especially since it can be linked to the outbreak of civil war, which in itself is arguably the most destabilizing form of violence in today's world. I was debating with myself if I should label this slide, "Would you buy a used car?" from this man. But this goes to illustrate the contemporary relevance of the research topic that I have been working on for a few years now. So in fact, more than 2 centuries after the Great Revolution, excluded groups keep fighting for recognition and access to power. Group-level inequality, especially exclusion and discrimination, are threatening the stability of ethnically diverse countries, including some of this country's main allies, with momentous security repercussions as a consequence. It is therefore perhaps no coincidence that even though they cannot agree on virtually anything else, ranking Democratic and Republican lawmakers agree on the need for Iraq's government to be as ethnically inclusive as possible. This was indeed confirmed by a joint letter addressed to the Iraqi Prime Minister Nur al-Maliki, who recently visited Washington, D.C. Troubled by the tendency of Maliki's Shia-dominated government to settle scores with the Sunni minority, President Obama hinted that future aid would be dependent on an inclusive approach to Iraq's minorities. Well, so then you would believe, based on this, that academics should agree on this. But in fact, they take a very different view. And here we have one of the most prominent experts on political violence and civil war in academia. This is Professor Paul Collier from Oxford University. And what he does is very useful. And I put this up, despite me disagreeing with him, I put it up because he has very much revolutionized the study of civil war in a very beneficial way. It used to be a bit of a backwater, but it really has turned into a much more sophisticated area of study, partly thanks to the use of statistics. But with that comes, of course, the economist's worldview, at least in the work of Collier. So it's a package that you don't really have to buy it. In fact, that's actually what I'm going to be arguing tonight. I'm going to try to use similar methods in order to prove the opposite of what Paul Collier has argued. So essentially, the really striking thing here is that Paul Collier argues that grievances and inequality are irrelevant for the outbreak of civil wars. And this is based on what you could call almost a labor market theory of civil war. So it's all about opportunity costs. You can think of this as a bunch of young men running around in the bush in Africa and then finding diamonds and jumping on them, and perhaps they also covet sneakers, and they go for it. And they fight their wars. They become, if they're lucky, warlords. They can enrich themselves. And it's all like basically a band of criminals. So this is, I would argue, perhaps banalizing, or so to say, simplifying what is very often a really political conflict in a way that goes very far. It's rhetorically quite striking. And in any case, here I put up a quote that, so to say, captures this type of mindset. So Collier is saying, so what causes civil war? Rebel movements themselves justify their actions in terms of a catalogue of grievances, repression, exploitation, exclusion. Politically motivated academics have piled in with their own hobby horses, which usually cast rebels as heroes. I have come to distrust this discourse of grievances as self-serving. This type of research has been tremendously influential also. I mean, after all, Paul Collier has been the research director of the World Bank, and you can see this view showing up in various places, including media, of course. So what I'm going to try to do here is to build on a very different set of ideas in order to reach some conclusions about the link between inequality and violence. And I do so, I guess it's perhaps no coincidence that Brandon O'Leary, who invited me to come here, is, well, can I say, Brandon, a student of Gellner's? And Gellner being the world's perhaps most famous theorist of nationalism. He unfortunately died in 1995. I think I was lucky enough to catch a glimpse of the great master when I was working in Britain in the mid-90s. I went to a lecture in Warwick where there was actually a debate between him and A.D. Smith, another very important scholar of nationalism. And there I was just blown away by the rhetorical skills and the wit of the great Gellner. And he defines nationalism as primarily a political principle which holds that the political and the national unit should be congruent. And this, of course, is a very this is a crisp definition that perhaps doesn't sound very emotional. It's mostly analytical, but it turns very explosive if the principle is violated. And that is, of course, what's going to provide the link to violence. So wherever nationalists have this principle violated, especially under conditions of alien rule, that is, if they have to live under the, so to say, people who are not like them, so foreigners running them, nationalists tend to be very, very unhappy. And in many, many cases, they also tend to resort to arms to, say, right these wrongs and reverse the situation and make sure that their own likes, their own kin, would be able to take over either through regime change, toppling the current government, or possibly breaking out from the state. Incidentally, I just told you about the American Revolution, reminding you that you live in a secessionist country, or a country that actually broke away from a larger political body. Now, Gellner painted a big picture. He wasn't into modern social science in the sense that he certainly wasn't using statistics, but in terms of theoretical groundbreaking work, he was absolutely formidable. Other people have, so to say, built on these principles. Here I chose to mention Frances Stewart, also from Oxford. She used to work in my college once upon a time when I was in Oxford myself. At that point, I didn't realize that I would actually be using her ideas, but she actually started studying horizontal inequalities a bit later, roughly 13 years ago. And as an development economist, it's a bit unusual that you have that you build on people from outside economics, and she certainly referred to Gellner as one of the main sources of inspiration. And it's actually horizontal inequalities that can be defined as inequalities in economic, social, and political dimensions or cultural status between culturally defined groups. And here is the important difference. So inequality, vertical inequality is based on individuals and households. So basically, this is a very different concept that here we are really comparing groups as a whole and not, so to say, vertically using the Gini coefficient, as the economists would call it. We are really comparing entire groups with each other. So you can have both types of inequality coexisting in the same at the same time, of course. And as it turns out, vertical inequality, socioeconomic inequality, can also lead to conflict under certain circumstances. They can lead to all sorts of bad things, as we all know. But here, indeed, I'm going to look at horizontal inequality, since this fits the whole notion of nationalism very naturally. And what we are going to try to do here is to bring up this book that was already referred to. I'm doing this as a little ad for those who may want to buy it, of course, but I promise to give you the executive summary of it if you're not a card-carrying political scientist, so you don't have to buy it to understand what's going on in the book. As you can see, the people, the co-authors here, including myself, Christian Gleditsch and Halvar Buhaug, sounds all very Scandinavian. We all come from Scandinavia, and it may not be a coincidence, because sometimes peace and conflict research, at least in Europe, looks a bit like a Scandinavian conspiracy. But it all depends on the fact that the Scandinavian governments have been heavily involved, not just in the UN and other international organizations, but they have also invested heavily in conflict research. And that is a very good thing, because think about it. Do you think you can go to the UN and just click on a web page and get a list of conflicts and data, or some other international organization? No, of course not. You cannot. There is no World Bank of conflict studies. There is no agreement on what conflict really, what it stands for. I remember when we had the Colombian ambassador visiting Zürich at one point, and I asked him about the civil war. And he said, what? There is no civil war in my country. Because obviously there is a tendency to refer to this as troubles or situations, or I guess troubles will be the Northern Irish term. It's up to us academics to do the homework when it comes to classifying and measuring and cataloging conflicts. And that's, so it's not a coincidence that we come from Scandinavia in this particular case, at least. Okay, so let me briefly tell you a little bit about the book. I promised to give you the executive summary, so I'm going to rush you through the main steps here. As you can see, it's a fairly simple story, really. We're trying to connect horizontal inequalities with civil war. And the macro link that's drawn here, that's where we have done our empirical work. We've been able to, using statistics, draw this link. And what we have to postulate, since we're trying to cover a lot of ground, I mean, we're covering all ethnic groups in the world from 1946 through 2009. We can't really be into the fine print, and we can test the mechanisms underlying this causal link. But we have to postulate a link to make believable what we are up to. And indeed, what you can see here is essentially that if we do this in two steps. It's notoriously difficult to measure grievances directly. You can do it, but we have chosen to say, make two steps. First, going from inequality to grievances by postulating a process that involves first group identification. People have to realize that they belong to certain collective groups, and they have to identify with them. And they also have to compare themselves with the other, as the many constructivists and anthropologists would say. And then, absolutely crucially, they also have to engage in some kind of evaluation of justice, or rather injustice. So it has, this is all linked to their own expectations, and perhaps also some kind of system of norms saying that it's not okay that we are being ruled by foreigners. Indeed, this is, of course, when nationalism comes in, when it comes to political power. And then in order for this to be held by enough people, these views to be held by enough people, there has to be some kind of creative process of framing and blaming. And this is indeed where you can use qualitative methods, where all the humanists help us a lot. This is about culture. It's about history. It's about writing. It's about rhetorics. And ultimately, it's about emotions. We rely a lot on new findings on emotions, although we're not really getting very deeply into this, but we differ, I guess, from many of our colleagues, certainly differ from the economists in that we take emotions seriously. Actually, this is a little bit unfair to economists in the name of interdisciplinary, say, communication. I really have to say that there are many economists who have been studying emotions recently, even in labs, and have come up with extremely interesting results. So I really have to give them credit for that as well. In any case, when it comes to getting from these grievances all the way up to civil war, you have to overcome formidable obstacles. I mean, this is what social scientists would call the collective action dilemma. Basically, it's about whether if you really hate the situation you're in and you would like to take on, say, a rather nasty dictator, would you then just rush out into the main marketplace and start yelling? Well, if you do that on your own, you're going to be mowed down, most likely. So this is really about, so say, overcoming these hurdles, because people are afraid of being killed. So how on earth can you make all these people move at the same time in order to topple a murderous regime? And we argue that this has a lot to do with grievances, the grievances themselves. So beyond a certain point, there's a tremendous fire in your belly if you're outraged. It's not enough just to be angry, of course, but this is a very, very important facilitating factor that lowers the threshold. So say that if you go from fear to resentment, it's a different logic. So that's essentially what we are arguing here. And beyond that, if the government then responds with repression, it gets really bad. And that would, to say, help trigger violence. Now, you have to find out what's going on here. Essentially, it's all garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have data, if you don't know what's going on, then you can't prove anything. And we have chosen here to invest a lot of time in data collection because we weren't happy with the data sets that pre-existed our project for various reasons. Lots of good work had been done, but for various reasons we decided to start from scratch. So we teamed up with colleagues from UCLA a few years back and started this new data set that really, it was nothing but a big online expert survey. So we decided to contact more than 100 people, and we had an online, so say, interface where the experts could, so say, fill in their own judgment and exactly about these ethnic groups. So it was very important to find out what groups there were to begin with. And this is notoriously tricky. And a number of anthropologists would probably be very skeptical of what we're up to, in the sense that, especially in Africa, you have different layers of identification, and all gets extremely tricky after a while. But I think we chose a reasonable compromise in the sense that we allow ethnic identification, all these group constellations, to vary over time. So we asked the experts to tell us about the periods, and obviously it wasn't just the group lists and the group ecologies changed over time, but most importantly, their access to power. So that was the key task here, because without looking at the representation within the executive of the country, you would not be able to test all these stories about nationalism. That was absolutely crucial. So essentially what we were trying to do here was to sort the groups as to whether they were excluded, the red bars on the right, or whether they were sharing power in the middle, and then on the left, the bluest bars here are the groups that, as I say, monopolize power or were running the country more or less alone. And it's rather intriguing to see the current situation here, that there are so many groups, after all, that are excluded, some of which, and this will be the bar all the way out on the right, are even actively discriminated by the government. So that was a very important exercise. We have an interface, or as I say, a website where you can actually get into all these groups and look at them. We have an extension to the data set that allows you to look at everything also with geographic information systems. You don't need to know anything about the software of geographic information systems to browse the groups both in space and time, the entire world. So I invite everyone to visit us on the web. Here, of course, this temporal dimension is also extremely important when it comes to power access, because to think of Iraq, it matters crucially whether you're looking at the period before or after 2003. To be a Sunni in Iraq was a rather pleasant thing until 2003, and then it became considerably less pleasant after the toppling of Saddam Hussein, when the Shia catapulted themselves into a leading position in a power-sharing regime. Okay, so that is the, all the footwork we had to do in terms of data collection to be able to analyze all this. And I'm going to tell you a bit now about what this all amounted to in terms of actual analytical results. And here you can see a stylized model of is actually taken from a sociologist, Charles Tilley, and the late Charles Tilley from Columbia University, who is one of my real heroes in the business. Although we actually, I guess I differ somewhat from Tilley's own take, but here it was very useful because he depicted the state as two realms. You have the polity with the government, with the insiders. So the shaded groups here are the included groups, as opposed to the excluded groups. Obviously, what we argue here is essentially that the shaded groups, the insiders, are going to be much more peaceful than the people who are outside. This is part of the logic here. And in fact, just going back to this classification, we argued that the red groups on the right are the excluded ones, and we have power sharing and domination on the left. So basically, if there's only one group that's monopolizing government, then you don't even have power sharing. But in this particular case, what I have depicted here is a hypothetical situation with a three-group, ethnic group in power constellation or coalition that's dominating the government. Now, what you can do is you can throw all this into statistical models, fairly standard. It's like a big Excel table. It's nothing but that, with some light statistical massaging of all this, and you can then start to compare what the conflict tendency is. Basically, the simple, even if you don't even apply any fancy statistics at all. You can just compare this in the table and look at the frequency. So how often do the excluded groups get into conflict, and how often do the included groups do that? And you see immediately, it just hits you that the excluded ones are indeed the ones that are much experiencing conflict much more. And in fact, on the right side of this figure of the slide, you see a very simple estimate. These funny little bars here essentially measure the probability that that a group is experiencing conflict. And the whiskers, the vertical lines, are, to say, some kind of measure of uncertainty. That the level, the probability lies somewhere essentially within these whiskers, and the little box is showing what the most, so say, what the most likely value is essentially. And as you can see, the whiskers don't overlap for the included and the excluded groups. So in fact, the probabilities that you see on the left side of the graph here are indeed very, very small, because the probability of conflict is, I mean, this is a low probability event to begin with, but there is a significant difference between these types of groups. That's not the only important result that we have found. We have also found that it matters hugely whether there's a change. So if you are downgraded, if you're so to say, deprived of your status, the probability of conflict goes up. It spikes up, especially during the 2-year period following that type of event. And that is highly significant with our statistical measures. And all that should just not be true if the economists or the political economists were right. If inequality and grievances would not play any role, this would be very mysterious indeed, that we would get this spike in the data. I'm coming back to this because there are always ways that you can hit back at our results. So I'll tell you the second part of the story, where we've tried to, so to say, fill the holes, or to say, to tighten our story even more. But for the time being, I think we can perhaps turn to just a few illustrations that will show you that this is real. We're not just talking about numbers here. We're actually talking about real situations where grievances and reactions to inequality would be very much there. And the Kurdish rebellion in Turkey has been going on for a very long time. I mean, as you know, the Turkish ruling ideology, ever since the Young Turks founded Turkey, this Kemalist principle is very much centralized. It's not very interested in ethnic pluralism, and the so-called Mountain Turks, that is the Kurds, have really been deprived of influence. In fact, it's got worse over time. In the 70s, there were some moves in a more inclusive direction, but then the military regime decided essentially to ban Kurdish as a language. And then it's gone back and forth, and more recently, in fact, there may actually be some hope that the current Turkish regime will be opening up. But there's a very clear link between this type of exclusion and discrimination on the one hand, and the fighting. I don't really even have to say much about the Palestinians. I mean, it's such an obvious case where ever since the founding of the State of Israel, you had a musical chairs situation. In fact, you could actually liken nationalism with a game of musical chairs. So basically, there are too few states out there and too many aspiring nations. And when the music stops, quite a few will be standing and not be able to find a chair to sit in. And that is the situation here. The Palestinians are among the people who never found a seat because there was someone sitting already by the time they tried to set up their state when the British left. And that is obviously, when it comes to discrimination and when it comes to the lack of political influence, it is a very, very prominent case, of course, and a very clear link to violence, between inequality, political inequality, and violence. But you have other cases, and I've put up the Côte d'Ivoire here. The Ivory Coast would be another case where the Northerners, so say, were reacting to a very ethnocentric campaign in the 90s that was pushing the idea of ivoirité, as it was called, as a way to exclude the North. And that led immediately to a civil war, even 2 rounds of civil war. And another case here, just one of many, would be the Achenese insurgency in Indonesia, where the oil was discovered, I think, in the 70s. And the Achenese felt that they were being exploited. This was essentially a situation where they would not get real influence, political influence, and reacted to that in insurgency. Now, I've already started to hint at the economic dimension, and in fact, this type of inequalities also spill into the economic realm. And what we argue in the book is that it's really combined with the political inequality, economic inequality would tend to make things worse. And we're really talking about direct group comparisons here. This again is a situation where the data, the information will be extremely hard to get at. There is no website, again, at the World Bank where you can go and click and get the wealth of all the ethnic groups in the world, because there wouldn't even be agreement on what are the ethnic groups to begin with, let alone how wealthy they are. So here the data situation is terrible, but we actually decided to adopt a very different method. Some people have been relying on surveys, but surveys are sometimes difficult because they are not covering all countries and all groups and may not be very easily comparable. So what we did was to adopt a spatial approach where we took an atlas of wealth from the Yale economist William Nordhaus. And based on this wealth atlas, we could then combine it with our own data on ethnic settlements. So essentially, on the left, you see this map. The squares that are darker are the wealthier ones. This is Yugoslavia. And you can see up on the left, within the country, you have the Slovenes. It's a little bit difficult to read, but let me see if I can use the pointer. I'm afraid that I'm going to do something terrible to is it the round, the round button in the middle, or? No, it's not. Well, I think I should probably refrain from that. It's also fancy and high-tech here that I would probably interrupt the whole presentation if I tried to point around. But in any case, it's easy to see that the Slovenes are the wealthy ones, and the Albanians or the Kosovars further down are the poorer ones. And you can then use the settlement areas as cookie cutters and go and use the geographic information system to cut out the corresponding wealth to get an estimate of the GDP per capita of each group, because we also have geographic data on population density. This is unbelievably difficult to do, and it took me my whole sabbatical and plus lots of hard work and with excellent team members in my group in Zurich, and we managed to stitch it together. And what comes out of this is a fairly dramatic result, in the sense that economic inequality of this type really does make a difference for conflict probability. So on the right, you see the diagram, the graph here, with a curve pointing upwards. So the black line is essentially the central tendency, and then the gray area is giving you some kind of measure of uncertainty where the real numbers may be. And of course, the further out you go, the more uncertainty, because we have less cases. But it's still clear that, and I should say something about the scale here. We're going from 1 to 6 here we're talking about how many times more wealthy or less wealthy the group is compared to the average of the country. And this is 6 is a big number. To be 6 times poorer than the average of your country means that you're pretty poor, and this is going to hurt. And that is indeed what applies to the Chechens. They are actually that poor. I didn't believe the numbers when we got this through our spatial method, and of course we double-checked this in the cases where we could, where we had other types of estimates. And I'm not going to get into any detail here, because there's no time, but essentially it's pretty clear that the Chechen rebellion against Russia has a lot to do with underdevelopment. I mean, it's not the only grievance the Chechens harbor, that I can tell you. I mean, for one, they were deported to Siberia by Stalin. Is a nice little gesture that unfortunately did not really help their economic development to begin with. So they didn't have warm and fuzzy feelings for the Russians to begin with. But there was clearly a major asymmetry in terms of wealth. Some of this was probably self-inflicted, but when it comes to the rhetorics and the mobilization, was used as a prominent theme to show how badly treated they were. The same thing applies to the Albanians in Kosovo. Also very much an underdeveloped part of the former Yugoslavia, where unemployment and the feeling that they were being shortchanged, not being offered the public goods that they deserved, was a part of the rhetorics very much. And you can find similar themes if you look into the literature on other rebellions, including the Chiapas in Mexico, the indigenous population. Here there are even terms used as internal colonialism, which is a fascinating term. It basically means that you're being exploited as if you were a colony within your own country, which I don't think necessarily is an exaggeration in this particular case. And I think actually the scholar who coined this term comes from Mexico, if I'm not wrong. You see the same story in the Philippines, the Muslim South, and the Bangsamoro rebellion has been classified as the work of Al-Qaeda. But if you start to look more carefully at this is really ethnic nationalism and not really some kind of story about terrorism. Incidentally, after 9/11, there were quite a few people who were trying to, and even before, of course, many rulers who didn't really want to deal with their excluded and discriminated populations would then try to write them off as terrorists. It's a very convenient way of, brushing aside what may be legitimate grievances. I'm not saying this because I'm condoning violence or that I think that there are no terrorists among these people, which there are, of course. But all the same, we have to be careful with that type of interpretations. Now, I'm coming to the second part of the talk here, and one important question is now, if exclusion causes conflict and civil war, then inclusion should cause peace. It's pretty simple, isn't it? Well, yes and no. I mean, you can react to situations of this type in different ways, and I put up 3 Ps here as possible reactions, and the recommendation that I would finally go for would be on the right, power sharing, and there are many different types of power sharing, and I'm going to tell you a bit about that. But certainly you could go for predominance, basically, or control, as Ian Lustig calls it. Brendan's colleague here in the political science department, who came up with this term, I think, in the late 70s, some time ago. And Assad certainly tries it. You can't really call that control right now, but he tried it for quite some time. Another solution would be partition. And people who don't really think that it's possible to do much would be plumping for predominance of partition. Give war a chance is a slogan you hear sometimes. Let them sort it out. Let the ethnic map get clear, basically cleaned up. Cleansing, perhaps even. That's to go a bit far, and not everybody who's skeptical about power sharing would go as far as that, but all the same, it's problematic to even partition may be the reward for people who would like to clean up the map, basically. But what I wanted to tell you about is that although it's a rather straightforward conclusion from the first part of our research that I just told you, that you should go for inclusion, ethnic inclusion, some kind of compromise. It's far from easy. One major problem is that once a conflict has erupted in a relationship between an ethnic group and a government, it changes everything. And it may be almost impossible to put this genie back into the bottle. But people argue basically that as soon as conflict is broken out, there's nothing you can do. People would hate each other till the end of time, are clearly wrong. There are successful cases of reconciliation. In fact, I think Brendan knows one case rather well in Northern Ireland. Not to be said that the place is completely peaceful and that everybody is happy, but certainly it's improved immensely, and there is power sharing. Without power sharing, there would not have been peace in Northern Ireland, I would venture to say here. But if you start to look at the differences, here I'm just giving you some results from our most recent research. We've actually found that if you compare pre-conflict to post-conflict situations, it's easy to see that the effect of power sharing and inclusion would be affected by this occurrence of prior violence. So these graphs should be read in the following way. You can see a vertical line on the right, the zero line, and basically we're here predicting the outcomes if either autonomy or full inclusion in power sharing at the center, or a combination of both would be applied. So if the distribution of outcomes is safely on the left side of the vertical line, the zero line, then you know that the impact on a conflict probability is negative, and that's a good thing because that's a reduction of conflict risk. And before violence is broken out in a relationship, it doesn't really matter exactly what you do. Whatever compromise, whether it's regional or whether it's within the center, a combination, they are very clearly helpful. As anyone coming from Switzerland would know, I mean, it's basically a no-brainer that if conflict hasn't broken out, you should preemptively and preventively offer concessions to prevent conflict from breaking out. In the case of prior conflict having already broken out, autonomy without inclusion at the center becomes much weaker. We label this too little, too late. So chances are that you would have to combine regional autonomy concessions with some type of inclusion at the center of the government, some kind of real power sharing. And this is actually something that was anticipated in Brendan's work. We're very much inspired by his work here, and we have now integrated that in our statistical modeling, and we're very happy to see this effect. I'm sure Brendan is happy too. What this is all encouraging. It shows that autonomy may be helpful, and certainly whatever you do, you should make sure that there is some kind of representation of the conflict parties within the government, the central government itself. Now, here is the problem. So far, what I've told you could be completely wrong. How could that possibly be the case? I mean, we've had this nice Excel table with, save for possible measurement error. It's a clear statistical link. But it's a correlation, it's not causation. There is this, well, actually, perhaps I should have put the skull together with reverse causation itself, because this is lethal to your causal inference, to your conclusions about what may be going on under the surface. So essentially, if you use a naive approach to causation here, and you don't consider the possibility of reverse causation, you would have to close all hospitals. And that would be a rather stupid thing to do. Perhaps if Obamacare doesn't work out, we may have to do that anyway, but that's a different story. The problem is this, that where do people die? In hospitals. People die at a much lower frequency outside hospitals. So the worst thing you can do is to go to a hospital, because you increase your probability of dying tremendously. So what's the problem with this argument? Well, it's not a random assignment. I mean, people go to hospitals because they are already seriously ill to begin with. So, in fact, the link from the skull, from death on the right to the hospital is a plus. So in anticipation of future death or health risks, you will go to hospital. So it could well be that the hospital has a negative influence on death. And it's the positive arrow that is responsible for this connection between the two. So by the same token, if we use this logic with power sharing, if it's the case that power sharing is invoked in cases that are really problematic to begin with, it could be that we're getting everything wrong. We are completely underestimating the pacifying effect of power sharing. It's the same argument as with the hospitals. So it may be as stupid to get rid of power sharing as it would be to get rid of hospitals based on this naive analysis that is not taking reverse causation into account. It's also called endogeneity, to use a more fancy term, but it's basically about reverse causation. It's the failure to realize that whatever you have in a table, which is a correlation, may not mean that you have causation, that what you have on one side is really causing the other thing, because it could be the reverse. So you really have to consider this seriously. I mean, you can always use reverse causation and endogeneity to finish off your colleagues who come up with results that you don't like. You say, it's all endogenous. You don't like the results. It's endogenous. I mean, it's an easy thing to say if you want to, if you don't like the results. But here we actually take the objections of our critics seriously, because they have raised exactly this. I mean, lo and behold, of course, or surprise, surprise, I should say, the political economists are the ones who have used this argument against our results. Okay, so what can you do with this? Well, now we're getting into some really tricky stuff. And I'm going to try to, this is the last part of my presentation, so there's hope on the horizon, but I'm still going to try the rather unwise idea of explaining to you what an instrumental variable is. I mean, quite a few people may be familiar with it, in which case it wouldn't be a problematic thing, but this is for people, for those who have not worked with econometrics, this can be a little bit tricky. And essentially, it's not that difficult. It just means that if you can find a factor that is basically causing what you would like to explain or use as an explanatory factor, if you can find a deeper cause that is clearly not affected by what you would like to explain in the end, then you are on the safe side. This is called an instrumental variable. So basically, you try to ground yourself. You try to find firm ground under your feet, where the measurement you're using, it's highly correlated with whatever you wanted to use as an explanation. And still, it cannot possibly be affected by the outcome that you want to explain. So in this case, of course, we would like to use inclusion as our variable, explaining conflict or the lack thereof. So it's a little bit, it's not ideal to have an arrow here. There should be a minus over it, I guess. But basically, what's happening here is that we're trying to go back to the colonial era to find an instrument that was to say, do the work without being affected by these post-colonial outcomes. So we're trying to explain conflict in the colonial dependencies after independence by using structures and differences that go back to colonial times. Because you cannot possibly argue that post-colonial conflict would be easily affecting those earlier historical decisions made way back. So this is an attempt to say to find this safer ground under your feet. And what we've done here is that we've taken the French and the British colonies, the blue areas being the French colonies and the red ones being the British ones, and we have taken all these groups that happen to be present at the moment of independence. And using now our geographic information, we've found a striking difference between the French and the British that we did not really expect from the beginning, but that actually makes sense. And it turns out that the ethnic geography of these empires differed quite a lot, in the sense that if you look at the likelihood of being included within the post-colonial regime that took over after the end of colonialism, it varied a lot with respect to the distance from the coast. So the French followed very much a standard development model. It's a center-periphery model whereby if you were out in the boonies, you were more likely to be excluded after colonialism. And they were fairly neutral in their, so to say, treatment of these groups with the centralized system, whereas the British used indirect rule, as it's called, and we call it selective indirect rule, in the sense that it's somewhat more likely that you'll be included after the end of colonialism if you're far away from the coast. Exactly the opposite of the French pattern. So this is partly the British used this method as a divide and rule trick to balance the powerful and wealthier groups at the coast by giving the guys away from the coast certain perks and positions so that they could, so say, divide and rule their colonies. And if you use this difference, this difference in ethnic geography as the main predictor of whether a group is going to be included after the end of colonialism, then you have a measure that is clearly not related directly to conflict. There's no particular reason why this difference itself should be related. Certainly distance from the coast in its own right, or whether you're British or you're French, that could be related to conflict. But the combination of both, so to say, the difference between these two, the red and the blue curve here, is clearly not related in any obvious way to conflict. So we argue that this is an instrument, or so to say, this stand-in factor that we can use in lieu of inclusion. And based on that estimate, or this strategy, we can then look at, what kind of effect inclusion has on conflict. And again, what we see is that we have been underestimating the effect of inclusion, which is what we expected. But here we have it in a much firmer way. Of course, it's not the entire world, but we think that these countries are diverse enough and also relevant enough for conflict that this is helpful. Okay, so I'm almost now at the end of the talk. I just wanted to say that if we're right about the link between inclusion and peace, then it would be great if power sharing and inclusion would be picking up over time and exclusion would be declining. And that is indeed what we are seeing, not at the pace that one would have wanted to see, but at least since the 1990s, since the end of the Cold War, we see actually a gradual decline of excluded groups around the world, whereas power sharing is now expanding. And that is indeed, if we are right, at least very good news. If you break this up and look at different parts of the world, you find a fascinating picture. So, for instance, you see that for the Middle East, it's terrible. They are way up there. And this is now, we've turned things around. We're looking at the excluded population over time. So the average share of countries that would be excluded. And the Western world is way down there. Obviously, since we've had our ethnic cleansing and sorted out most of these problems way back, as Michael Mann at UCLA would tell us and remind us that we are basically celebrating our democracies on the mass graves of the various groups that didn't make it in the game of musical chairs. But what you see is that between the extremes, there is a declining tendency. So basically, the Middle East remains the basket case when it comes to exclusion. It's not just in terms of democracy, a very problematic place, but ethnic discrimination. I mean, you only have to look at Assad's Syria, the ethnic minority rule. We were predicting that there would be conflict there before it happened, and we were not at all surprised that that regime collapsed. So in our models, it will show up as one of the high-risk places. But obviously, Israel is another place. Saudi Arabia even has a Shiite minority close to the oil fields in the east that people may not be aware of. Okay, so I want to wrap up at this point, but this is telling you that there is some hope. There's more work to be done when it comes to convincing people that we should be encouraging ethnic nationalists to find a compromise. First of all, we should, I think, or I hope I have convinced you that group-level inequality is a really bad thing, and that it's the risk of civil war goes up, and that ethnic inclusion can be helpful, with some caveats. The regional autonomy may be too little too late, but as soon as you have some kind of governmental inclusion, things are looking up. That has some intriguing policy implications. I mean, you should be aware of people who are trying to go for majoritarian democracy at any price, elections right away, without thinking about who gets to vote. Who is the demos, so to say? Who belongs? Who is the citizen to begin with? And there are a number of cases out there where the regime has basically decided to get rid of people by denying them citizenship or denying them influence, and then keeping the goodies, the democratic goodies, for the insiders. So that's something to watch out for. And certainly state capacity in its own right is not enough. So if you give the ethnic minority ruler all the weapons and the goodies, it's just a strong state is not going to do it. Considerations of justice would be absolutely critical here. And finally, partition is still, I haven't done enough systematic research on that to say anything definitive on this, but the literature I've read would at least put a big question mark whether this is a good idea, because it tends to give people perverse incentives. if you want to become the UN ambassador at some point, you should start your own little rebellion, and sooner or later you can go to New York and be a big fish in a small pond. There are reasons to be very, very cautious when it comes to partition. But as you can tell, I guess my own upbringing, coming from Scandinavia, full of reasonable people who are used to striking bargains and engaging in compromises, would tend to shine through here. I wish it were as easy to sell this message as it is to sell flat pack furniture, another Swedish product. Unfortunately, it's a little bit harder, but I will keep at it, and thank you for your attention.
I was wondering, did you code North American and European democracies, and if so, how did you code the ethnic groups, and how did you find their income data, since they're not clustered geographically, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, we coded the ethnic inclusion in all countries. We had some intriguing discrepancies between democracy and inclusion. For instance, the Baltic states are among the places where you have the biggest difference. I mean, they are coded as perfect democracies, but they deny the Russians citizenship and the right to vote unless they learn the native language of the Baltic states, say either Estonian or whatever it might be. So that's one case where you have a difference. But your question is also about the economic.
I'm actually interested specifically in how you coded the U.S.
In terms of
like what are the ethnic groups? Because there could be a huge number of
our experts told us to use we're using standard categories like Caucasians, Hispanics, and the African Americans in a fairly standard way. And so, what was the particular question?
How do you make choices not to include like groups
like
Asian Americans and which in themselves includes huge number of groups? Like, how do you draw these distinctions?
Yeah, this is a judgment call, because what we are trying to do here is that we're trying to look at access to the executive. So how likely is it that your guy is going to, or girl, is going to be president or member of the cabinet? So, for instance, for African Americans, it was absolutely inconceivable for a very long time, and it was only recently, as we all know, that it really became possible. So around the time of Colin Powell's candidature, or possible candidature to the White House, and also Condoleezza Rice, etc., being in the cabinet, it was clear that the African Americans should be considered to be part of a power sharing arrangement. But it's not power sharing, obviously, in the sense that we have power sharing in Switzerland, where big institutional differences, of course, that we have to keep in mind.
So you code the U.S. as power sharing.
Yeah, power sharing is not power sharing in the institutional sense, but according to this classification, it means that all these groups have access to the executive.
So, in this series, we've been talking a lot about different kinds of violence: structural violence, physical violence, non-violence, and different kinds of conflict. How did you define conflict when you were making using your data and knowing conflicts have different durations, whether they're channeled through a political system or not? And how do you think that impacted your findings?
Sure. Should I speak into the mic, or is it okay like this?
Why don't you take this mic out?
Okay. Thank you. Coding conflict was somewhat outsourced in the sense that we have been relying on standard data set from Uppsala, Sweden, and PRIO, where you have a whole set of conflicts or civil wars. And what we did to connect that data set with our ethnic groups was to code a mapping between the rebel groups that were involved in these fights and the ethnic groups. And the connection had to involve two things. You had to have both a claim and participation in the fighting. So it was, in this sense, it was not just bean counting, not that there were just a bunch of fighters. They had the rebel organization would have to say, in a meaningful way, fight for at least, well, for the group in question. So that was the, to say, data collection effort that we had to engage in.
I find that fascinating and, of course, generally congenial. I would like to know, and this follows up the question from Matt Berkman, something more about power sharing here. It seems that you have inside power sharing two distinct categories, namely descriptive inclusion of all the major ethnic groups in the executive. But you also have those cases where you have cross-community executive power sharing, where you have the deliberate inclusion of people as specific representatives of their groups, as opposed to simply being of the group. And what's fascinating is power sharing, including both those categories, is extraordinarily successful in conflict reduction. Have you explored the interior of power sharing to find whether the particular types of power sharing matter, or are they more or less similar in their consequences?
I can use the mic here. Well, in fact, we are waiting for data from colleagues. I mean, we have a project where we would like to use power sharing data together with our, so say, more behavioral type of coding, to have more precise institutional measures of power sharing, to say, combine them. And so the question is on our minds, but it's coming up.
I have a question about to what extent this is a story about men, and what happens when you put gender in the mix in terms of both how women respond to the absence of power and their participation in conflict.
Well, gender is certainly very much relevant to the study of civil wars, and there is actually a whole literature on this. For instance, sexual violence is a very important aspect of warfare, as we all know, not just civil wars, of course. As the master cleavage, it's difficult to imagine that gender would play a role, because these ethnicity cannot be reduced to gender in that sense. But gender plays a very, very important role when it comes to the framing activities that I alluded to in the theoretical scheme. So we haven't, I'm not an expert on this, but I'm absolutely, I do know, and I've read enough to see that, to say, gendered language can be used to say, justify, to for instance, to belittle or even insult opponents, to depict them as effeminate in a masculine culture. This can be a very, very effective way of using rhetorics. So definitely it's very much relevant, but I don't think it's primarily, it's not touching the issue of who is being excluded or discriminated at the collective level. I mean, we're really dealing with macro issues here. So it's more about the mechanisms and exactly how that may change our estimates for different subgroups of societies or groups or cultures that may be more or less chauvinist, for instance. That is an issue that would be fascinating to look into.
I'm interested in the governmental inclusion, and it occurs to me that there's the actual structural governmental inclusion, but then once you have people included, then there's likely to be policy change. And so I'm wondering what the key variable is to the degree that you either have done research or want to speculate in terms of the governmental inclusion, and thinking also of tokenism and how tokenism doesn't do the trick. So.
Yeah. Well, we've been very careful not to count what we think are token members of governments. This is a judgment call, and I would admit right away that the whole EPR data set is dependent on certain judgment calls. What we have tried to do, of course, is to compare those judgment calls across cases to see that we're roughly right. So, for instance, Tariq Aziz, the former foreign minister of Saddam Hussein's regime, was actually Christian. Actually, Stalin was a Georgian from the beginning. It doesn't mean that the Soviet Union should be coded as Georgian ethnic. Of course, there is assimilation. And some of the most difficult cases, some of the most difficult judgment calls we had to make in Western Europe, ironically enough, especially the UK. What do you do with the fact that well, it was even before our sample period, but Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of the UK, was actually Welsh. So does that mean we have a Welsh UK at that point? Not necessarily, of course. So you have to discount for, you have to ask yourself, to what extent does the person, having been elected into the cabinet, really represent the group in a meaningful way? If the person is essentially completely assimilated into the dominating ethnic group and doing its business and not really paying any attention whatsoever to the ethnic group, the original ethnic group, then we would not count that as any meaningful representation. But again, so you can't just do bean counting. You have to understand what the power situation of the country is like.
So we are actually out of time. Perhaps there's a chance for some questions at the podium afterwards. But please join me in thanking Lars-Erik Cederman for his wonderful talk.